Bengal, India, 1943. Not a battlefield. Not a war zone in any conventional sense. No bombs falling here. No German aircraft in the sky. No panzers rolling across the horizon. Just villages, rice fields, a river delta so lush and green that travelers had called it one of the most fertile places on earth for 300 years. And in those villages, people were dying by the millions, not from bullets, not from gas, from hunger. Children whose bodies had been reduced to arrangements of bone and translucent skin lie in the dirt of village streets too weak to raise their hands. Mothers who had walked for days toward Calcutta carrying children who died before they arrived. Entire families found together in the positions in which they had finally stopped moving, in the corners of huts that had once held rice and now held nothing. Bodies piled at the edges of roads, bodies in ditches, bodies in the rivers. The smell of death so pervasive across an entire region that it became the ambient atmosphere of a civilization in the process of being erased. 3 million people, some estimates say 4 million, dead in Bengal in 1943. Dead while India was part of the British Empire. Dead while the British government controlled India's food supply, its export policies, its rail networks, its administrative decisions. Dead while Winston Churchill, the man the world was in the process of crowning as the greatest hero of the 20th century, sat in the cabinet war rooms in London and made choices. One of those choices was to continue exporting grain from India to Britain and to British military stockpiles, even as reports of mass starvation arrived on his desk with mounting urgency. Another was to reject relief shipments offered by Australia and Canada, arguing that the ships couldn't be spared. Another was to write, in the margins of official documents pleading for intervention, a question that his officials never forgot. If food was so scarce, why hadn't Gandhi died yet? Winston Churchill, the man with the cigar and the V sign and the voice that held Western civilization together in its darkest hour. The man who told the British people they would fight on the beaches and fight on the landing grounds and never surrender. The man whose statue stands in Parliament Square in London, whom poll after poll has crowned the greatest Briton who ever lived. The man who watched 3 million people starve to death and blamed it on them for breeding like rabbits. If you think you know this story, if you think Churchill is simply the hero the history books gave you, what comes next is going to be profoundly uncomfortable. Subscribe now, because the truth of Winston Churchill is not one story. It is 2 stories occupying the same body, and understanding both is one of the most important acts of historical honesty the 21st century is being asked to perform. November 30th, 1874. Blenheim Palace, Oxfordshire, England. The palace itself tells you everything you need to know about the world into which Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born. Blenheim is not a house. It is a statement. A Baroque monument to British military glory built by a grateful nation for the first Duke of Marlborough after his victory over the French at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. It covers over 7 acres of floor space. It sits in 2,000 acres of parkland designed by Capability Brown. It is the only non-royal, non-episcopal building in England to carry the title of palace. This was Winston Churchill's ancestral home. This was the atmosphere he breathed from birth. Not wealth exactly. The Churchills were chronically cash-poor despite their aristocratic grandeur, but something more intoxicating than wealth, the absolute bone-deep conviction of civilizational superiority, of inherited destiny, of belonging to a race and a class and an empire that was not merely powerful, but rightfully powerful, divinely appointed to govern the lesser portions of the earth for their own good. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, a brilliant, erratic conservative politician whose career burned hot and brief, who rose meteorically and fell just as fast through a catastrophic political miscalculation, and who died of what was then called syphilitic dementia at 45 years old, by which point he barely recognized his own son. His mother was Jenny Jerome, an American socialite of extraordinary beauty and social ambition, the daughter of a New York financier, who had married into the British aristocracy and who treated her children with the affectionate detachment of someone who had more important engagements elsewhere. Winston adored her from a distance. He adored his father from a greater distance. The person he was actually closest to in his early years was his Irish nanny, Mrs. Everest, a warm, devoted woman who was eventually dismissed by the Churchill family when Winston was in his 20s, a dismissal that reportedly broke his heart and that he never entirely forgave. He attended her deathbed. He paid for her gravestone out of his own pocket. He kept her photograph on his desk until the day he died. This detail matters because it tells you that beneath the armor of aristocratic self-assurance and imperial conviction, there was a man of genuine emotional depth and loyalty. It tells you that Winston Churchill's capacity for human feeling was real, and that makes the rest of the story simultaneously harder and more necessary to understand, because the crimes of people who feel nothing are one kind of historical problem, and the crimes of people who feel deeply but reserve that feeling for some human beings while categorically excluding others are a different kind, more complex, more instructive, and in some ways more disturbing. He was a lonely, unhappy child who was sent to boarding school at 7 and spent his early years writing desperate letters home that were rarely answered. He struggled academically, not from lack of intelligence, which was obvious and enormous, but from a temperament that refused to be disciplined by subject matter found unworthy of its attention. He was ranked near the bottom of his class at Harrow. He failed the entrance exam to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst twice before passing on his third attempt. He was, by the standard metrics of his educational establishment, a disappointment. What he had instead of conventional academic performance was something that could not be measured by examinations, a prose style of almost supernatural power, an imagination of cinematic scale, a memory that retained everything it found interesting with photographic fidelity, an ego so enormous and so confident of its own rightness that it could absorb almost any setback without fundamental damage, and an ambition that was not merely personal but messianic, a certainty that he was marked for historical greatness that came from somewhere deeper than simple vanity. It came from a man who had been told since birth, by the very stones of the palace he grew up in, that his family had changed the course of civilization once before and might yet do it again. He went looking for war the way other young men of his class went looking for hunting, adventure, glory, the imperial adventure. In 1895, as a 21-year-old recently commissioned cavalry officer, he traveled to Cuba as an observer with the Spanish forces fighting a colonial insurgency, and came home with a lifelong love of cigars and afternoon naps. In 1897, he went to the northwest frontier of India, what is now Pakistan, with the Malakand field force fighting Pashtun tribes, and wrote a book about it. In 1898, he charged with the 21st Lancers at the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan, the last great cavalry charge in British military history, and wrote a book about it. In 1899, he went to South Africa to cover the Boer War as a journalist, was captured, escaped from a prisoner of war camp in a feat of genuine personal daring, and wrote a book about it. He was always writing, always narrating, always constructing the story of himself with the deliberate craft of someone who understood, instinctively, that history belongs to the people who write it. But in those years of imperial adventure, something else was being constructed alongside the personal legend, a worldview, a framework for understanding the human species that was, by any honest reckoning, one of the most explicitly racist political philosophies held by any major figure of the 20th century, and this in a century that was not exactly sure of competition for that distinction. Churchill believed, with the confident straightforwardness of a man who had never had serious occasion to question it, in a hierarchy of civilizations and races with a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant at its apex. This was not a secret view held in private. He expressed it openly in his books, in his speeches, in his official correspondence, in his conversations with colleagues. He wrote in 1899 of how the Dervish forces' army had massacred at Omdurman were savages whose destruction was a service to civilization. He wrote of the Pashtun tribesmen of the frontier as a race of fire who understood nothing but force. He advocated for the use of chemical weapons against uncivilized tribes in the aftermath of the First World War, specifically against Kurdish rebels in Iraq, writing in a memorandum that he was strongly in favor of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes, and that the moral effect should be so good that would save time and soldiers. These are not misquotes. They are in the historical record. They are available in the archives. And they are not aberrations. They are expressions of a coherent ideology that Churchill held consistently throughout his life, and that shaped the decisions he made when he held power over the lives of millions of people who were not white and not British and not, in his framework, fully deserving of the same consideration as the people who were. If this is making you uncomfortable, If you're wrestling with the gap between the Churchill you were taught about and the Churchill in these documents, that discomfort is the right response. Drop a like on this video, because the discomfort is the point, and we're only halfway through. He entered Parliament in 1900. He switched parties from conservative to liberal in 1904, following his convictions on free trade. He switched back from liberal to conservative in 1924, following other convictions. His political career was marked by audacity, controversy, enormous mistakes, and occasional moments of genuine visionary insight, all delivered with the rhetorical force of a man who simply could not make a dull sentence if he tried. As First Lord of the Admiralty at the outbreak of the First World War, he championed the Gallipoli Campaign, a strategic concept that was genuinely innovative in its thinking and catastrophic in its execution. The plan was to force the Dardanelles Straits, capture Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a southern supply line to Russia. It was, in theory, a way to break the deadlock on the Western Front without sending another generation of men into the meat grinder of the trenches. In practice, it resulted in over 500,000 casualties on both sides, the heroic and futile deaths of thousands of Australian and New Zealand soldiers at Anzac Cove, and a defeat so humiliating that Churchill was removed from the Admiralty and spent years in the political wilderness. He went to the Western Front himself for a time, as a commanding officer in the trenches, leading men under fire. He demonstrated again that whatever his failures of judgment, physical courage was never among them. He returned to government. He served as Secretary of State for War, then Colonial Secretary, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, a role in which he returned Britain to the gold standard in 1925, a decision that most economists consider a serious error that contributed to years of economic hardship and unemployment. He was, throughout the 1920s, simultaneously one of the most prominent and one of the most distrusted political figures in Britain, a man whose brilliance was undeniable and whose judgment was considered by many of his colleagues to be fundamentally unreliable. Then came the 1930s, and the wilderness years, and the issue that would define everything. When Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, the British political establishment's response was shaped by exhaustion, appeasement, and a deep, genuine terror of another war. The men who governed Britain in the 1930s had lived through the First World War. They had watched an entire generation of young men disappear into the mud of Flanders. They would do almost anything to prevent a repetition. And so they convinced themselves, or allowed themselves to be convinced, that Hitler was a rational actor with finite territorial demands, that his grievances against the Versailles settlement were legitimate, that Germany had been treated too harshly after the First World War, and that reasonable concessions would satisfy him. Churchill did not believe this. From very early in the Nazi period, Churchill was sounding alarms that his colleagues found embarrassing in their directness and their refusal to accommodate the diplomatic necessities of the moment. He spoke in the House of Commons again and again through the mid to late 1930s about the danger of German rearmament, about the inadequacy of British air defenses, about the fecklessness of appeasement, about what Hitler actually represented. He was largely ignored. He was considered an alarmist, a warmonger, a man whose judgment had been catastrophically wrong at Gallipoli, and whose desperate need for relevance was distorting his reading of the situation. When Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich in September 1938, waving a piece of paper and proclaiming peace for our time, the nation celebrated with near hysterical relief. Churchill alone stood in Parliament and said, "We have suffered a total and unmitigated defeat." The House, by many accounts, responded with barely suppressed contempt. He was right. And the fact that he was right consistently, insistently, infuriatingly right about the single greatest threat the world would face in the 20th century is the foundation of the legend. It is the thing that makes everything else complicated. Because when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and Britain declared war, the moral vindication was total. The man who had been a political embarrassment for a decade was suddenly the only man in the country who had been telling the truth. And on May 10, 1940, as German forces swept through the Ardennes in a stroke of military genius that the British and French high commands had considered impossible, Neville Chamberlain resigned and Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was 65 years old. He had waited his entire life for this moment. He believed, as he had believed since childhood, as Blenheim Palace had whispered to him across decades, that he'd been put on Earth for exactly this. What Churchill did in the summer of 1940 is, by any honest assessment, one of the most extraordinary acts of political leadership in the history of the modern world. And it must be stated clearly, without equivocation, before anything else is said. Without Winston Churchill, the outcome of the Second World War in its European dimension might have been fundamentally different. In May and June of 1940, Britain stood alone. France was collapsing. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. A miraculous rescue, but a rescue from a catastrophic military defeat nonetheless. The United States was officially neutral, its population deeply resistant to involvement in another European war. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. Italy had joined the Axis, and within Churchill's own war cabinet, there were serious senior figures, including Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, who were arguing that Britain should explore a negotiated peace settlement with Hitler. Explore a negotiated settlement with Adolf Hitler in June 1940. In a series of meetings in late May 1940 that have been the subject of books and films and endless historical analysis, Churchill faced this argument directly and defeated it. Not with military force, but with language, with conviction, with a refusal so absolute and so emotionally overwhelming that it changed the course of the debate and, arguably, the course of the war. He told his cabinet, and this account comes from the notes of those who were present, that if they entered negotiations with Hitler, they would never recover their position, that Britain would become a puppet state, that the nature of the Nazi regime meant that any settlement would be not peace, but subjugation, and that he would rather see London laid in ruins than make that bargain. Then he went out and gave some of the most powerful speeches in the history of human communication. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Those words were not decoration. They were load-bearing walls of a civilization that was in danger of collapsing. They convinced the British people, at a moment of maximum danger and minimum realistic hope, that what was being asked of them was possible, and more than possible, necessary and right. They bought the time for America to end the war. They kept the Atlantic supply lines open. They made D-Day possible. They made the defeat of Nazi Germany possible. The man who spoke those words saved more lives than almost any individual in the 20th century. He also presided over a famine that killed 3 million people and blamed them for their own deaths. Both of these things are true, simultaneously, in the same lifetime. And here is where the real darkness lives. Not in choosing between these facts, but in refusing to look away from either of them. Let's go back to Bengal. In 1943, while British and American forces were fighting in North Africa and beginning the long, grinding process of pushing back against the Axis in the Mediterranean, a different catastrophe was unfolding on the other side of the world. Bengal, one of the most densely populated regions of the Indian subcontinent, experienced a famine of devastating proportions. The causes were multiple and interlocking. A devastating cyclone in 1942 had damaged crops. A Japanese invasion of Burma had disrupted traditional rice imports. Wartime inflation had made food unaffordable for the poorest populations. Rice prices had tripled. Local merchants hoarded supplies, gambling on further price increases. But superimposed on all of these local factors was a series of deliberate British imperial policy decisions that transformed a serious food crisis into a catastrophe of mass death. The British colonial government in India, reporting to Churchill's war cabinet in London, implemented a scorched earth policy in Bengal's coastal regions in 1942, fearing a Japanese invasion. Thousands of boats were destroyed, the same boats that Bengali fishermen used to catch food and traders used to move rice between regions. The deliberate denial policy effectively destroyed a transport network that the local economy depended on for its food supply. Rice was then exported out of India to Ceylon, to the Middle East, to other strategic stockpiles. Even as the famine reports began arriving, a wartime policy called denial of rice deliberately withheld food supplies from coastal districts to prevent them falling into Japanese hands, without making adequate provision for the civilian population that depended on those supplies. When the famine became undeniable, when the bodies in the streets of Calcutta could no longer be ignored, the Indian government began pleading with London for relief shipments. The Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, sent urgent requests. The Viceroy of India sent urgent requests. The Governor of Bengal sent urgent requests. Requests went to the War Cabinet. Requests went to Churchill personally. What came back were delays, denials, and in some recorded instances, expressions of contempt. Churchill's War Cabinet diverted ships that were in a region and capable of carrying food to other purposes. Australia offered to send wheat. The offer was refused or redirected away from Bengal. Canada offered grain. The cabinet declined. In internal communications, Churchill expressed frustration with the Indians for the situation. A population that was starving to death under British imperial rule was, in his framing, being inconvenient. The historian Madhusri Mukherjee, who wrote one of the most exhaustively researched accounts of the Bengal famine, Churchill's Secret War, documented through cabinet papers and official correspondence how decisions made in London shaped the death toll in Bengal. The records are not ambiguous. They are not subject to serious scholarly dispute. They are in the archives in black and white with initials and dates. Churchill was not the sole cause of the Bengal famine, but he was the most powerful decision-maker in the system that failed to prevent it and actively made it worse. And his private expressions about the Indian people, that they were a beastly people with a beastly religion, that their suffering was a result of breeding like rabbits, reveal that the policy failures were not simply the result of wartime distraction or administrative overload. They were colored, at least in part, by the ideology of racial hierarchy that Churchill had carried with him from Blenheim Palace through every year of his public life. 3 million people, maybe 4, dead, while the empire that ruled them prioritized other things. And it wasn't only Bengal. The history of Churchill's imperial record is a history of consistent, documented support for the use of violence against colonized populations who sought their own freedom. In Ireland, he championed the deployment of the Black and Tans, paramilitary forces whose campaign of reprisal terrorism against the Irish civilian population in 1920 and 1921 included the burning of Cork City Centre, random shootings, and atrocities that the British government at the time formally and privately acknowledged were war crimes. He was enthusiastic about their deployment and dismissive of Irish grievances. In Kenya, in the early 1950s, the British colonial government's response to the Mau Mau uprising, which occurred while Churchill was serving his second term as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955, included the detention of over 1.5 million Kikuyu people in concentration camps where systematic torture, including castration, beating, and sexual violence, was carried out as official British policy. The cabinet papers from this period show that Churchill's government was aware of at least some of what was happening. The full scale of it was suppressed, classified, and in some cases physically destroyed. Thousands of documents were shredded as Kenyan independence approached to prevent their disclosure. Those documents that survived were only released in 2012. The British government settled a legal claim by Kenyan victims of colonial torture in 2013. The Foreign Secretary at the time said the British government sincerely regrets what happened, sincerely regrets. In Palestine, Churchill's support for Zionist settlement through the Balfour Declaration, which he championed as colonial secretary in the early 1920s, laid the groundwork for one of the most intractable conflicts in human history, a conflict still producing casualties today. His dismissal of Arab concerns about Jewish immigration to Palestine was shaped, once again, by the imperial hierarchy in his worldview. The Arabs of Palestine were, in his framework, a less civilized people whose objections to the transformation of their homeland were of secondary importance to British strategic interests, and his own genuine sympathy with Jewish political aspirations. He was not a simple villain in any of these cases. The complications are real. His support for Zionism was, in part, a product of genuine sympathy for Jewish people at a moment when European anti-Semitism was building toward genocide. His wartime decisions about food supplies in Bengal were made by a man fighting a war for survival with genuinely limited resources and 1,000 competing demands. Context always exists. History always has layers. But context is not the same as exculpation. And the consistent pattern of a man who felt deep, genuine empathy for certain categories of human beings, while applying a fundamentally different moral calculus to others based on their race, their religion, their place in the imperial hierarchy, is not something that can be explained away by wartime necessity. If you've been watching this whole story unfold and feeling that particular combination of admiration and moral horror, subscribe to this channel, because this is exactly the kind of history that most platforms don't want to sit with. The uncomfortable truth, the whole truth. There is one more dimension of the Churchill story that rarely makes it into the television tributes and the parliamentary eulogies. It is a dimension that his closest colleagues experience most directly, the dimension of the man himself. Winston Churchill was, in private, both more admirable and more terrible than the public legend captures. His courage was real. His loyalty to the people he loved was fierce and consistent. His energy was volcanic. He worked from his bed until noon, surrounded by papers and boxes in his red dispatch cases, conducting meetings in his pajamas and dictating correspondence while bathing, before rising to spend the afternoon and evening in a sustained fury of activity that exhausted men 30 years his junior. He slept barely 5 hours a night during the critical years of the war. He flew in aircraft over the Atlantic and the Mediterranean during a period when such flights were genuinely dangerous, refusing to allow his physical safety to constrain his strategic movements. He drank extraordinary quantities of alcohol throughout his adult life. Champagne before breakfast, whiskey and soda through the day, brandy after dinner, wine at meals, and the question of whether this constituted clinical dependence or simply a historically anomalous tolerance remains contested. His own doctor, Lord Moran, kept detailed private diaries that were published after Churchill's death and that revealed a man who was physically far more fragile than his public image suggested, prone to deep depressive episodes, subject to what he called his black dog, the recurring darkness that could descend without warning and against which he fought his entire life. The black dog. The phrase Churchill used for his depression has become perhaps the most famous description of that condition in the English language. And it is genuinely poignant, this acknowledgement in the private vocabulary of the most publicly defiant man of the century, that there was something in him that defiance could not reach, something that the speeches and cigars and the champagne and the sheer force of his personality could hold at bay for stretches of time but never fully defeat. His relationship with his wife, Clementine, was one of the more extraordinary partnerships in the history of British public life. She was intelligent, perceptive, morally serious in ways that sometimes exceeded her husband's own compass, and absolutely devoted, while also being absolutely clear-eyed about his flaws. She told him the truth when almost no one else would. She wrote him a letter in June 1940, during the most critical weeks of the war, warning him that his behavior toward his staff, his rudeness, his explosive temper, his contemptuous dismissal of people who disagreed with him, was damaging his effectiveness and morale of those around him. That letter, its existence, the fact that a woman wrote it to the most powerful man in Britain during the most dangerous weeks in British history, and the fact that he kept it, says something important about both of them. He could be monumentally cruel to the people who worked for him. He could be dismissive, contemptuous, childishly petulant when contradicted. General Alan Brooke, his chief of the Imperial General Staff throughout much of the war, the man who arguably did more than anyone else to translate Churchill's strategic visions into military reality, while also preventing several of Churchill's worst strategic impulses from becoming catastrophes, kept a private diary throughout the war that was equally admiring and despairing. Brooke recorded his genuine awe at Churchill's energy, his vision, his courage. He also recorded his private anguish at the man's stubbornness, his refusal to accept military advice he didn't want to hear, his insistence on pursuing strategic operations, like a Second Gallipoli, a push to the soft underbelly of Europe, adventures in Norway and the Aegean, that his professional military advisors considered wasteful and dangerous. Churchill overruled his generals, sometimes for good reasons, and sometimes for bad ones, and the difference between those categories has occupied military historians for 80 years. The end of the war brought Churchill a defeat he did not anticipate and never fully accepted. In July 1945, with the war in Europe won and the war in the Pacific still grinding toward its conclusion, the British people went to the polls in a general election and voted Winston Churchill out of office in a landslide. The Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, a quiet, precise, self-effacing man whom Churchill had famously described as a modest man with much to be modest about, won a majority so large that it shocked everyone, including Attlee himself. Churchill was reportedly devastated. Clementine, by some accounts, told him it might be a blessing in disguise. He replied that the disguise was very convincing, but the British people's reasoning was not, as Churchill seems to have experienced it, a personal rejection. They had elected the man they needed for the war. Now, they needed a different kind of man for the peace, someone who would build a national health service, who would expand social welfare, who would dismantle the class structures that the shared suffering of the war had made intolerable to people who had been asked to die for a country that had never fully treated them as equals. They chose correctly for the moment they were in. The NHS that Attlee's government built has saved more British lives than almost any other single institution in the country's history. Churchill returned to power in 1951, age 77, already showing signs of cerebrovascular decline that would eventually kill him. He suffered a severe stroke in 1953 that was concealed from the public. Another secret, another thing the official story didn't quite capture. He served until 1955, when he finally resigned, aged 80, in a farewell that was handled with characteristic theatrical dignity. He spent his remaining years at his country home, Churchill, painting, the hobby he had taken up during the wilderness years after the Gallipoli disaster, and which remained one of the few activities that could quiet the noise in his head. He was not, by any account, a great painter. He was a dedicated, enthusiastic, intermittently talented amateur who painted hundreds of canvases, and who found in the act of painting something that politics and war and rhetoric couldn't give him, a problem you could solve within the edges of a canvas, with no consequences for anyone but yourself. He died on January 24th, 1965, 70 years to the day after the death of his father, Lord Randolph, aged 90 years old. He had survived 2 world wars, a plane crash, a car accident, multiple strokes, decades of alcohol consumption that would have destroyed a lesser constitution, and a specific form of inner darkness that had stalked him since youth. His state funeral was the largest in British history. World leaders came from across the globe. The coffin was carried on a barge along the Thames, and as it passed, the cranes of the London docks, operated by dock workers who were among the most politically radical in Britain, men who had little natural affinity for the aristocratic conservative imperialist being mourned, dipped their arms in salute. It was a gesture of pure human respect for a human being whose complexity defied the categories in which we usually try to contain our historical judgments. So, what do we do with Winston Churchill? This is not a rhetorical question. It is one of the most practically urgent questions in the current conversation about history, memory, and moral accounting. His statues have been vandalized. His name has been removed from some institutions. Counter-arguments have been mounted with equal passion, and the debate has sometimes generated more heat than light, because both sides have been tempted to simplify, to flatten the three-dimensional contradictory, historically located human being into either an unblemished hero or a straightforward villain, neither of which he was. He was not an unblemished hero. The Bengal famine alone, 3 million, possibly 4 million, dead under British imperial governance, while Churchill made decisions that historians have documented contributed to death toll, places him in a category of moral responsibility that the hero narrative cannot honestly accommodate. The chemical weapons advocacy, the Irish policy, the Kenya detention camps that his second government permitted, the consistent application of a racial hierarchy that he never seriously questioned and that shaped the lives and deaths of millions of people across the British Empire. These are not footnotes. They are not the unfortunate but inevitable product of their time. Other people of Churchill's time, in Britain and elsewhere, did question those hierarchies, did reject those frameworks, and were ignored or punished for it. The fact that racism was common in his era does not make Churchill's racism unworthy of examination, and he was not a straightforward villain. The summer of 1940 was real. The speeches were real. The refusal to negotiate with Hitler at a moment when the case for negotiation had serious, senior advocates within his own government was an act of political and moral courage that genuinely changed the course of history. The partnerships he built, with Roosevelt, with Stalin, with the Dominion governments, with the occupied nations of Europe, were executed with a diplomatic skill and personal force that was not inevitable and was not easily replaceable. A different prime minister in May 1940 might, very plausibly, have led Britain toward a settlement with Nazi Germany. We do not know what that world would have looked like. We have every reason to believe it would have been far worse than the world we have. Both things are true, and the discomfort of holding both things simultaneously is not a problem to be resolved by choosing one and discarding the other. It is a correct response to a genuinely complicated historical reality. History is full of people who did terrible things in one context and necessary things in another. History is full of people whose capacity for empathy was real but bounded by class, by race, by the assumptions of their culture, by the limitations of their imagination, by the failures of their moral education. The question is not whether Churchill was good or evil in some cosmic sense. The question is, what do we learn from the full truth of him? What does it tell us about the systems he inhabited, the empire, the class structure, the racial ideology, that could take a man of genuine intelligence and genuine human feeling and produce the decisions he made about Bengal, about the black and tans, about the Mau Mau, about the Arab population Palestine? Those systems did not die with Churchill. They evolved. They found new languages and new justifications and new institutional forms. The hierarchy of whose lives count more, whose suffering generates a policy response, and whose suffering generates a marginal note, is not a 19th century imperial anachronism. It is a feature of every society that has not yet done the full, honest, uncomfortable work of accounting for where its wealth came from, and whose lives were spent to produce it. Comment below and tell me, does knowing this change how you think about the icons history gives you? Because that question is more important than any answer I could give you here. January 30th, 1965. London, the River Thames. Winston Churchill's coffin is carried on the MV Havengore, a small survey vessel of the Port of London Authority, along a stretch of river that he had known since childhood. The day is gray and cold. The banks of the Thames are lined with people standing in silence. On the south bank, the great cranes of the Hayes Wharf lean forward and then bow, their long arms dipping toward the water as the barge passes. Somewhere in Bengal, in the country that is now Bangladesh, the grandchildren of the famine survivors are going about their lives in the early morning. Lives made possible by the fact that their grandparents survived what 3 or 4 million of their neighbors did not. They do not know that a man is being mourned in London. They do not know his name. Most of them, the history that connects their grandparents' suffering to the decisions made in that cabinet war room on King Charles Street, did not make it into their school books. The gap between what happened and what is remembered is one of the most consequential spaces in human history. It is the space in which the lessons go unlearned, in which the patterns repeat, in which the next crisis finds us equipped with hero myths and insufficient with uncomfortable truths. Winston Churchill was the right man for one specific, catastrophic, world historical emergency. He was, simultaneously, the wrong man for the people his empire governed, wrong for them in ways that cost millions of lives. He held Western civilization together with one hand, while the other hand was complicit in cruelties that his civilization was supposed to stand against. He gave the world its most famous speeches about freedom while presiding over an empire whose fundamental premise was the denial of freedom to hundreds of millions of people based on where they were born and what they looked like. He was not unique in this. He was, in many ways, typical of his class, his time, his empire, his assumptions. And that is precisely the problem, because the typical is not the same as the inevitable, and the comfortable myth of the hero, without shadow, is not history. It is a permission slip for the present to repeat the past without recognizing it. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that the people who lived in the shadow of history deserve to have their story told alongside the people who stood in its light, because that is what honest history asks of us. Not to tear down, not to simply venerate, but to look fully, steadily, and without flinching at the whole human truth of the people who shaped the world we inherited. The cranes on the Thames bowed as he passed. 3 million graves in Bengal had no cranes to bow over them, no river to carry them, no cameras, just the silence that follows when the powerful decide that some lives were worth accounting for and some lives were not. That silence has never fully ended. And until we learn to hear it, really hear it, it never will.